Hey, I'm Brian Brown, and this is my series on structural racism in the United States for East Hampton Public Schools. It's been a while. I had to take a little time off to start getting ready for the school year, which is starting up. Teachers are already back at work, and had to do some trainings for a course. So took a little time off. I'm glad you're back. I'm sad to report that this is still a very necessary thing for us to be talking about. The good news is that you're still paying attention, all right? That you're still on board with this, or about learning about it at least. I said at the very introduction of this video series that for white people, racism and specifically things like police violence against people of color, for white people, this structural racism can be like a bad nightmare. All right, there are some times when it's right up in our face, and there are, and then we can choose to forget about it. That's our privilege. All right, we can try to get back to sleep from that nightmare. All right, even if it disturbs us for a couple days, if we want, we can go back to our lives and not have to think about it. What is interesting about 2020 is that, people are not forgetting about it. People are not trying to go back to sleep. People are on board to try to get some change happening, and that's good, right? America is supposed to be about freedom and equality, and we want it. We want America to be everything it can be. So people are leaning in and trying to help us move closer towards equality. Some horrible stuff has happened since we last talked, it's gonna keep happening. We've got to do something to change it. Okay, so a couple quick things. Quick recap. So this overall series, we started with the end of slavery, with the idea that for hundreds of years, the wealth of America, of this country, not just the South, but certainly the South, but the infrastructure of America, and especially the wealth of all of America, not just the South, was built on the unpaid labor of human beings, African Americans, people who had been sold into or born into slavery, a specific type of slavery, chattel slavery, where people are treated like livestock. Absolutely no consideration for human rights. Despite the fact that millions of people were born in America, which is what it takes to be a citizen of America, they were denied not only the rights of American citizenship, but their own humanity. And so when the 13th Amendment ends slavery, there's a whole lot of reason to rejoice, but there are a block of people, very powerful people, who are now in a bind because their entire wealth, their entire existence was based on the idea that they got to treat these human beings like livestock, and these sort of white slave-owning, plantation owner, wealthy, powerful people, they certainly weren't going to start working, all right? And they weren't going to make less money if they could handle it, all right? Now, the North isn't, blameless in this at all, right? A lot of the industry, a lot of the finances in the North, a lot of Northern companies wanted to come down and set up business in the South, and they were able to do that on the cheap because the entire economy of the South was destroyed. All right, so this isn't just about those plantation owners, but it's the American economy in general. It depended on slavery. All right, it was built on slavery. It was built on the unpaid labor of people, and the wealth of America was built at that time. Now, because people weren't going to start working and because they didn't want to make any less money, nobody wants to make any less money, they had to figure out how to get slave-like conditions again, and so they take advantage of that clause in the 13th Amendment that says slavery is still legal if punishable by crime, and so we see black codes, vagrancy laws, and the establishment of chain gangs, which reinstitutes basic slave labor in the American South. All right, and that is also a criminal justice issue. So the idea that racism and criminal justice is just some new thing that we've only been starting to talk about since Trayvon Martin is just false. All right, you go back to slavery times, really. Anyway, 1896 is Plessy versus Ferguson. That's a Supreme Court case that basically says that segregation is illegal. That you can have separate institutions based on race, it's just that they have to be equal, separate but equal. And so from 1896 to the mid-1950s, we have the era of Jim Crow, and the Supreme Court is just on board with legal segregation. With Brown versus Board of Education, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, in the mid-60s, we see the end of Jim Crow. Now, segregation in the 60s is no longer legal, but we have plenty of what we call de facto segregation. So de jure would be, this is something that is set by law. De facto just means that in reality it is. Okay, and so in this series we've looked at things like housing, things like the GI Bill, things like insurance and redlining, and practices of real estate agents and so on and so forth that continued the practice of segregation. In the 21st century, of course, we see things like the neighborhood school movement, which is really moving away from integrated schools to back to segregated schools, because if we still live in segregated neighborhoods, then if we go back to neighborhood schools, then we're going back to segregated schools. Okay, so this sort of third part of the series is going to talk about the idea of the new Jim Crow. And so this is where I give, a big citation, a big shout out to Michelle Alexander. So Michelle Alexander wrote a book called The New Jim Crow that really reframed how we talk about criminal justice. If you haven't gotten a chance to read Michelle Alexander's book, I highly recommend it. I'm sure you're getting a million recommendations for books and podcasts and news articles and so on and so forth that you can read. Go with those, check them out, see where your interest is. If you're really looking to understand sort of this phase of structural racism in America, especially as it relates to criminal justice, you can't do any better than reading The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. And so if you have read it, you're going to see that a lot of my argument really follows her argument, and it's for good reason. It's because most people's argument follows her argument. It was a game changer, this book. Okay, and so what does the new Jim Crow mean? Well, the new Jim Crow means that this era that we're currently in, all right, is not a result of that first era of taking advantage of the loophole in the 13th Amendment to have slavery. It's not taking advantage of Plessy versus Ferguson, where it's just legal to segregate. All right, we don't have slavery, but we have segregation. All right, what's this new era about? All right, and so here's the general argument. All right, these days, and we've seen since the 1980s, a massive spike in incarceration, in people who are in the criminal justice system, either in local and county jails, in prisons, state prisons, federal prisons, right? But also people who are on probation, people who are on parole, people who are under the supervision of the criminal justice system. And we have passed a lot of restrictions that deny people who have been a part of the criminal justice system some basic rights. All right. And we're going to talk pretty much mostly about felony convictions. So a felony is a serious crime, right? A felony is a crime where you can be punished by a year in prison for it, all right? A felony is no joke. People who have been convicted of felonies in many states cannot vote. Sometimes for the rest of their life they can't vote. People who have been convicted of felonies may not be able to serve on a jury. They may not be able to possess firearms. There are also some laws that are passed during the 90s, during the Clinton era, that say that people who have been convicted of a felony cannot stay in public housing, even if they're just a guest there. So if I have a felony conviction and I get out of prison, I don't have a place to stay, I don't have any money, I haven't had a job in a while, I've been in prison. If I go stay with my aunt and she lives in public housing and somebody finds out, my aunt can actually get her right to public housing taken away. So not only can I not get public housing, and I might need it because it's super hard to find a job if you have a felony conviction, but I can't even stay there, or I'm endangering people who are trying to help me out. Okay, and so there are all sorts of restrictions against people who have felonies. Now, probably a lot of you are asking the big question. Well, it's a statement really. Maybe people shouldn't have gotten a felony. Maybe people shouldn't have broken the law, and they wouldn't have to worry about this. And yeah, in a lot of cases that's a true thing. Okay, but what we're going to look at, because we're talking about structural racism here, all right, we're going to look at why, or at least how people of color are targeted, are arrested more, are imprisoned more, are given worse sentences, and so on and so forth, than white people in America. Okay, so black people in America make up about 12% of the population. Latinos, another 14, 15%, something like that. And yet, those two groups are disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system. All right, in jail, in prison, on parole, on probation. Does that mean that people of color are more likely to commit crimes? It doesn't. All right. The priorities of law enforcement, the discretion, all right, of where do people look for crimes being committed, all right? So discretion on the part of police forces, and then discretion on the part of prosecutors, district attorneys, and so on and so forth, all right? There is enormous amount of leeway, there's an enormous amount of room for bias in both of those areas that have drastically led to people of color being misrepresented proportionally in the population of the criminal justice system. Okay, and so we're going to talk about that in two videos. There'll be one on discretion of police officers. There's going to be one on discretion of prosecutors in plea bargaining and stuff like that. Okay, so a couple general things about the idea of mass incarceration. So a lot of the legislation, a lot of the change that happened that sort of gave us the era that we're currently in took place during the 80s and the 90s. All right. Now, as I said in previous videos, you have a couple things that go on. But there's the war on drugs and there's the Southern strategy. The Southern strategy is a strategy by the Republican Party to come in and scoop up a huge block of voters that had given up on the Democratic Party. So until the 1960s, Southern white racist voters, pro-segregation, white supremacist voters, people with that, that's a group of people, right? They had sided right along with the Democratic Party. Down south, there wasn't even a Republican Party. People were still mad about that whole Civil War thing. They were mad about Reconstruction and Lincoln and all that, stuff. And so the Republican Party didn't exist in the South. Anyway, when Lyndon Johnson, right, a Texas Democrat, signs this big civil rights legislation in the 1960s, there's a whole bunch of racist white voters in America, especially in the South, who don't want to have anything to do with the Democrats anymore. The Republican Party sees that and they come in and they scoop it up, all right? And that really starts with President Nixon, all right? But President Reagan also goes out and just targets that group of people really hard. And so you see this massive shift from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party as far as the racist white vote goes. Does this mean that I'm saying that all Republicans are racist? Nope, not at all, all right? But I am saying that there was this block of voters. They used to be Democrats. The Republicans said, I bet we can win them over. Let's get them. And they did. And I talked a little bit about that before. Okay, so that's the Southern strategy. War on drugs also is a sort of a Nixon to Reagan thing. So Nixon had two big enemies that he identified, the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement. All right, and you know, it's come out very clearly, very well documented that that he believed that, and that he knew that he couldn't make it illegal to protest against the war. He knew that he couldn't make it illegal to ask for civil rights. But what he did instead was he worked very hard to emphasize and to associate the anti-war movement with cannabis and the civil rights movement with heroin. All right, and so there was a massive attempt to associate, you know, hippies with smoking pot and black people for being on heroin. And so, you know, that was sort of where the war on drugs started, but it really kicked off during the Reagan era. All right, now an important thing to think about when we talk about criminal justice is this. All right, just because the president says he wants something doesn't mean that the local police station has to do it. All right, if you are in charge of a police station, all right, a local city or town police, okay, you have a limited amount of resources, all right, and you got to pay for all sorts of stuff. You have to pay, you know, the wages of your police officers, but you also have to pay for, you know, cruisers and equipment and uniforms. You have to pay to train people. All right, a police station needs ballpoint pens and paper clips and, you know, all sorts of things, right? You got to have a finite amount of money. And because you have limited human resources, all right, you want to try to do what people want, all right? So things like violent crime, things like property crime, all right? Those are things that police departments, they want to deal with, all right? So if somebody in the street out in front of my house right now hits somebody else with a baseball bat, all right, the person who got hit with a baseball bat is going to come to the police and say, hey, this guy hit me with a baseball bat, like, can you go find him? All right? Or if somebody, you know, breaks into my car and, you know, steals something out of my car while I'm sitting here talking to you, all right, I'm going to say, hey, somebody just stole something out of my car, can you go get that person? All right? That's the kind of thing, police are, you know, are really good at that. You know, you have a victim, you have a perpetrator, you know, the victim often provides a description, you go out, you get that person, all right? And everybody's happy in that situation. Policing drug crime is really different because the parties who are engaged both don't want to get caught, all right? It doesn't happen very often. Somebody has to be pretty high, I think, to call up the police and be like, hey, I just bought drugs, you should arrest me and the guy who sold them to me, all right? So the police, you need to put in more human hours just trying to catch people engaging in drugs. I'm not saying that people shouldn't be trying to stop, you know, a lot of the things that drugs do are horrific, right? Like, you know, I'm not, it's not my position that police should ignore drugs. But the point is that if you are a local police chief and you have certain priorities, all right, you are not, you get more results if you focus on property crime and violent crime. And so the president can say, go out and bust people for drugs, but, you know, you're like, I will if I can, but people aren't calling for it, and it costs more money. And so what President Nixon and then, you know, sort of President Reagan sort of improves on is this way to bring local and state police departments around on this. And it has to do with money, right? Everybody needs money to function. And so the idea is that if you can show whether it's state police, local police, if you can show that you're prioritizing going out and catching drug crimes, you're going to get federal money for training. You might get access to intelligence from the military or from our intelligence agencies, and you can get equipment and so on and so forth. And so all of a sudden, police departments who mainly would be like, yeah, we'll bust people for drugs if we can catch them, but we can't be going out and trying to find that. That's not a good use of our resources. All of a sudden, they see the benefit to that. They're like, oh, well, we get a lot more money, and then you sort of count on that money coming in, so you got to keep it up. All right, and so when we're looking at things that people are hoping to change about the way that police departments work, one of the things that we talk about is militarization of the police force, and so just the amount and the sort of grade of weapons and so on and so forth that police departments have access to. Now, things like that used to be illegal. If you're a student of the Constitution, you probably know that that the framers, the people who wrote the Constitution, who formed our country, they were very, very worried about. They were really worried about tyranny, about the government having too much power, and so they have in all these protections, these separations of powers and checks and balances and so on and so forth. And there were a lot of, we know about the big ones often, the president can veto this or, so on and so forth. The judicial review, the Supreme Court can decide that a law was unconstitutional. The powers that these main branches of government have over each other. But there's a lot of smaller ones too that we don't know about. And so there are a lot of separations, for example, between the CIA and the FBI. All right, CIA is supposed to be concerned with stuff that's going on outside the United States, FBI stuff going on inside. And so I think in the assassinations videos, we talked a little bit about COINTELPRO, which was a collaboration between the CIA and the FBI, which was illegal, that was specifically targeting civil rights leaders and stuff like that. Anyway, over the course of the 70s and 80s, a lot of these laws that said, the military can't give police forces military-grade weapons, or they can't give them intelligence, they're not supposed to collaborate. A lot of these laws were actually dismantled so that the federal government could basically get local law enforcement to prioritize the war on drugs. Okay? Now, a lot of drugs are really bad, right? They wreck lives. You've seen it, I've seen it, we've all seen it. Why are we talking about this with structural racism? Well, the problem here is that what people have found, what researchers have found pretty much across the board, is that people of color, white people, people on all levels of the socioeconomic scale, they all use drugs about the same. And drug dealing happens locally, right? So wealthy white people sell drugs to wealthy white people, right? Poor Latinos sell drugs to poor Latinos. People tend to sell drugs within their community, all right? People are pretty much there's a certain percentage of the population that's using drugs, all right? Yet we have this enormous disproportionate representation of people of color who are in prisons and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of reasons to explain that, all right? If we had a lot more time, we could dive deep on that one, okay? But the point is that if police departments decided to start busting college campuses, all right, for drugs, think about how that would change the proportion of people in prison and so on and so forth, as far as socioeconomics goes, as far as race goes, etc. Okay, so the war on drugs has to do with structural racism because people of color are disproportionately arrested. All right, so the next couple of videos are going to really look at the discretion that goes into it, which leaves us open to bias. Okay? I don't have time in this series to explain bias and prejudice to you, and there are a whole lot of people who are better qualified to teach you about that than me. All right? I really encourage you to go out and try to understand that. Okay? But the idea that this criminal justice system, that our government in general is supposed to be set up to prevent bias, for there to be equality. There are a lot of rules that are written and so on and so forth to try to keep things equal. All right? But when we leave openings for discretion, when we leave things open for human decision, all right, on the part of police departments or individual officers, prosecutors, and so on and so forth, and when there is such an active campaign from different parts of the through the media, through the government, and so on and so forth, that reinforce racial biases, ideas of white supremacy, which we talked about in some earlier videos. When in a society that is so steeped in messages of white supremacy and bias against people of color, we shouldn't be shocked that, given discretion, police forces are targeting people of color more than white people based on unconscious assumptions, sometimes conscious. There are some people who are actively racist, no question about it. All right? That prosecutors, that juries, that judges, unconsciously or consciously, are disproportionately stopping, searching, arresting, prosecuting, and convicting people of color more than they are white people. All right? And so that's the next couple videos are going to be a couple targeted areas to look at that, and then we'll finish this thing up with a look at the Black Lives Matter movement. So anyway, that's today's video. Good to see you. We'll see you next time. Thank you.